The state treasury scores another record monthly take, but do nature and international politics suggest a slowdown? Closed highways, harbored cargo barges, submerged farm fields. We'll have an update. Those global tariff wars. We'll hear some expert views of our stake in the standoff with Mexico, Canada, China, and the world. And the world's biggest retailer is already feeling the impact, if not enough, to suit an irate visitor. Arkansas Week coming up.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.
Hello again, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us. We got a taste of presidential politics this week, a taste as a Democratic socialist dropped by a citadel of free enterprise during its annual celebration of American capitalism. We'll get to that in a moment in our roundtable. And anyway, our broadcast deals largely with the dollars and cents of Arkansas. Can record tax collections continue, or will an overflowing Arkansas dampen the Arkansas economy? Another threat looms: tariff wars with China and trade tensions involving Arkansas's two largest markets. Up top tonight, Dr. Mervin Jebaraj, director of the University of Arkansas Center for Economic Research, and Dr. Michael Pakko of UA Little Rock's Institute for Economic Advancement. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us. The trade, the tariff situation shifts hourly. We're taping it mid-morning on Friday. By Friday evening, when we first make air, we haven't a clue what will unfold. But still, when I talk to businessmen, they tell me they want some certainty, some predictability, some stability in terms of both import and export markets. Doctor, we don't seem to have that right now.
Well, I think, a couple of weeks ago we saw an announcement that the United States would back off their steel and aluminum tariffs with Canada and Mexico, and in return, Canada and Mexico would back off their retaliatory tariffs that had hit all of our exports. That was the good piece of news 2 weeks ago, but since then we've compounded that with the announcement that we may impose 5% tariffs on Mexico starting on Monday, which means that the retaliatory tariffs will be back on, especially on Arkansas exports, and it really does raise questions about the passage of the new NAFTA or the USMCA.
Michael.
Yeah, I think it's kind of ironic that on the same day that the president announced this 5% tariff on Mexico, that his people were submitting the proposals to Congress to ratify the revised NAFTA agreement. So it kind of gums up the works there. But yes, it's a very fluid, rapidly moving situation. I understand that U.S. and Mexico are engaged in talks now about border security in order to try to head off this 5% tariff threat that is scheduled to go into effect on Monday.
Yeah, and at least in terms of the ag sector anyway, we've got farm fields where farmers can't put a crop in.
Well, yes, the weather, the flooding and all that has been an issue. And we haven't heard any threats of retaliatory tariffs from Mexico, but if they should decide that that would be appropriate, once again, I'm afraid that it's the Arkansas farmer that's there to take it on the chin. Mexico is our largest export market for rice, buying about 20% of U.S. exports, along with other agricultural products, particularly from Arkansas: dairy, meat, poultry, and paper and pulp. So we have a vigorous trade with Mexico, and putting these barriers in place isn't helpful.
All right. What is there a way out?
Sure. I think both sides could reach an agreement fairly quickly, and I think you've seen the Mexican government offer some concessions about moving National Guard troops to the southern border that Mexico has with the rest of Central America to stem the flow of some migrants, and if everyone in the administration deems that is enough, then we could move on. I don't think there is any political appetite in Congress here or in other countries for an extended trade war with Mexico, not with a 5% tariff starting on Monday. I think business is really looking forward to the end of the trade war with Canada and Mexico, and they don't want to start this over.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about this situation is that this is a tariff being imposed with the policy idea having to do with border security, not trade.
He's tied the two.
He's tied the two together. I mean, it almost seems like when your favorite tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, using tariff policy to implement this. But I think that concerns business leaders too, because it does seem to be whenever something bothers the president, he'll pull out the tariff tool.
And I do think that it affects the passage of the new NAFTA deal, not just here in the United States, but in Canada and Mexico. So Canadian politics is a little wishy-washy now. The leader of the Canadian Parliament is under political pressure, so it's an open question about whether he'll be able to pass this deal through. And the same problem in Mexico is that Canada and Mexico had actually agreed with the United States as a side agreement to prevent the U.S. from imposing Section 232 tariffs, which was a previous national security argument that we imposed steel and aluminum tariffs. So we can't impose tariffs under that section of our law. And now we found a different section of the law to impose tariffs on. So then it raises the question about what they really agreed with us, that in the future we wouldn't do this to them. So it really does reopen whether they've agreed to a good agreement with us or not.
And that's another issue of uncertainty, is just exactly what authority the president is proposing to raise these tariffs. He's talking about declaring a new national emergency for the inflow at the border. And I think there's a lot of pushback from Congress on those kind of unilateral moves on the part of the president.
Our sagging grain prices owing not just to the tariff situation, but also to the weather and to, in some crops anyway, a world oversupply of some commodities. Plus, we haven't even mentioned Cuba, which that's a just steadily diminishing market owing to some political considerations. But Arkansas consumers and Arkansas producers, are we already, and to what extent are we already feeling the impact in Arkansas of this instability?
I think Arkansas producers have felt this instability ever since the tariff war started with this administration. And so when we look at markets where Arkansas farmers can sell their products to, China was a great market to sell products to, Cuba would have been a new market they sold products to, and with the TPP would have opened new markets across
the Pacific Agreement. The
Pacific Agreement would have opened new markets for Arkansas farmers as well. China's now gone, at least for as far as we can see. Cuba is not happening anymore, and TPP was shelved. So we've seen across the board, American consumers are about eating as much food as they can that's being produced here. Their new markets are really going to be abroad, and if we don't have new trade agreements, it's going to be hard to find new markets, especially when we're losing the markets that we've worked so hard on cultivating in China and places.
Yeah. And even without retaliation on Mexico's part, the tariffs that we're putting on imports from Mexico itself are going to raise consumer prices, and this is expected to particularly impact the automobile industry. There's an awful lot of cross-border production, supply chains, parts and motor vehicles can cross the border up to 8 times before they're completed. So it's a very integrated international process, and to put these tariffs on, interrupting those supply lines, is expected to raise prices. If it gets to the point where we have a 25% tariff on Mexican imports, Deutsche Bank has estimated that it'll raise the cost of an automobile in America by about $1,300. So that's probably the sector that's the most affected directly by the tariffs on the border with Mexico.
Yeah, and
this is very punitive. You mentioned goods move across the border 8 times in the process of manufacturing, and that's 5% tariff every time it passes the border, so it adds up very quickly.
And we tend to, I'm glad we brought up manufacturing, because we tend to focus, because we're such an ag is so visible in Arkansas, but we have a vibrant, or we certainly hope it continues to be, ever more vibrant manufacturing sector that is impacted as well. We export a lot of hard goods, finished goods.
And we import a lot of the inputs for that manufacturing process, a lot of the heavy
metals,
machinery, electrical equipment, and ores and metals. We do export steel to Mexico and net.
Yeah, and the raw materials that we bring in actually, aid manufacturing jobs here in the United States. So if we're imposing tariffs on our own manufacturers, that reduces our competitive position with the rest of the world, so it will drag down our exports as well.
The quote is a couple of weeks cold, but it is maybe one of the most repeated or often cited in the last fortnight, and that is the comment by the CFO of Walmart on these tariffs, particularly from Asia. Look, we'll try to eat some of this, but we can't eat all of it, so consumers, be on the lookout.
Yeah, the incidence or the burden of tariffs is kind of a complicated matter. Economists study this a lot. It ends up hurting pretty much everyone who's involved in the transaction. A lot of the costs are passed along to consumers, but the importers sometimes are forced to bear some of that burden. Sometimes the exporters themselves lower their prices or give some other consideration to try to offset the additional cost of the tariff. And it all depends kind of on what economists call the elasticity of demand as to whether consumers have substitutes or not, and how this affects prices at various levels in the chain.
Looking at the Arkansas economy, if we as best we can, we had another record revenue month in May at the state treasury. Unemployment remains low. Or do you see some warning signs out there, though?
I think
something we ought to keep our eye on.
I think the biggest warning sign you look at GDP growth in the state, and actually we thought we had a pretty good GDP growth in the past several years, but they revised most of that down. And in big part, some of those revisions occurred in the agricultural sector, and so that is not growing as much as we would want it to, obviously because of the trade war and weather. But I think the underlying issue with the Arkansas economy that we really haven't dealt with yet is, yes, we have a really low unemployment rate, but our labor force participation rate, especially among the prime age population, people between 25 and 54, remains really low. And we have one of the lowest labor force participation rates in the country. So yes, the headline unemployment rate looks great, but there's a lot of people that should be working, could be working, that are not working in Arkansas today.
Yeah.
And as far as where the growth is happening in the sectors, we've seen some really encouraging signs of manufacturing employment growth over the past year and a half or so. That's kind of been offset by a slowdown in job growth in the service providing sectors, especially professional and business services and leisure and hospitality and health. So if we see that these tariffs and international tensions are putting a hurt on manufacturing, that slows down the one sector that seems to be doing well at this point in Arkansas's growth.
The national report, anyway, on both job creation in May and wage increases was disappointing, frankly, certainly in terms of job creation, less than half what had been anticipated. Is that going to filter down?
I hate to take 1 month's worth of data and extrapolate on it. On average this year, we've averaged about 150,000 jobs a month. We only need about 100,000 to keep the unemployment rate where it is, so we're doing okay in that respect. But of course, if we see a few more readings like this, the concerning part, I think, is that they've revised down $75,000 worth of 75,000 jobs in the past 2 months as well. So I think we're trending in the wrong direction. But we'll have to wait and see for more jobs reports before we decide.
Yeah, Michael, you can go.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. One month's slow job growth is not anything to really get concerned about, especially since we've seen a couple of fairly strong months, albeit with downward revisions. So I don't think there's any signs that we're seeing an imminent slowdown in GDP growth or job creation on the national level. And like I said, the patterns are still good, a little bit shifting patterns for Arkansas, but we'll see how these latest developments affect that.
All right, gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us. Thank you for your insights and your data. And we'll be back with a roundtable in a moment. And back now with a pair of pals, Lance Turner from Arkansas Business and Steve Brawner, and independent journalist. Gentlemen, we had as mentioned earlier, we had a quite nice May revenue report.
That's right.
Another record.
Another record for a month. $496 million above forecast and above last May. Also, like we said, is a record for the month. So all in all, here in Arkansas, despite some things that we'll talk about, I think, later in the broadcast, feeling pretty good about where the economy stands in terms of the tax collections that the state is pulling in, and also looking at a little bit of a budget surplus as the fiscal year wraps up.
And of course, the administration, Steve, would like to sit on it as long as possible. Prudent. I mean, it's rainy day.
Well, that was created this past legislative session, an emphasis on kind of saving up money, the realization being that this economic expansion is not going to go on forever, and in fact, it maybe appears to be slowing a little bit. But the governor's going to be happy with this. He's managed to cut taxes. He's managed to kind of increase spending in some areas he wanted to increase spending in, highways for one. And yet Arkansas still is managing to run a surplus right now. It's above forecast by $195 million in the first 11 months of the year. That enables the governor to kind of feel good about where we are, and so all in all, it's based on the strong economy. That's why this is happening. And so as long as the economy is good, we'll have these numbers. When the economy starts going down, we'll see what happens. Numerically, it can't go on forever.
Yeah, our first taste of Cassandra in the broadcast on this segment anyway. We had a jobs report, as mentioned. It was a little disappointing at the national level, and also wage increases were not what they had hoped to be. Plus, we had some discouraging news down at Crossett this past week.
That's right. Yeah. So I guess we'll talk Crossett for a minute. The Georgia Pacific plant in Crossett. They've got a massive plant down there, and they do a lot of different things at that plant. But Georgia Pacific this week announced that it was going to stop bleached board operations at that plant, and that's kind of your packaging, your cardboard box kind of stuff. They were going to end that operation, and that was going to cost more than 500 jobs. And also they were going to completely close and Hope, a particle board plant there, and that was going to be another 100 jobs lost. And all this stuff is happening. The Crossett operation will shutter by October. The Hope operation will close within the next month or two. So that's big in terms of the number of jobs, but it's also big in terms of just the impact of that entire industry.
And certainly on South Arkansas, too.
Certainly in South Arkansas. And you know, there had been there's a problem down there. We talked to some industry executives, and there's a problem with a lot of oversupply in terms of timber product. There's a lot of wood fuel out there. There's just a glut of it. And so there's going to be more of a glut of it is the point, because this Crossett plant used a lot of that stuff. The hope has been that the Sun paper plant that's planned for Arkadelphia was going to eat up some of that capacity. Well, now the Sun paper plant is even more important to the industry than it ever has been in terms of the glut of product, because this Crossett operation is going away.
And the Sun plant is
delayed, hung up in the Chinese U.S. tariff tiff that continues to drag on, and so the outcome of that is not clear. Sun Paper and people connected with Arkansas Economic Development say that it is going forward. That project has actually changed its scope and sort of what it's supposed to be in the last couple of years. They've decided to go a different direction in terms of what they're going to produce there. And so that's caused them to have to start completely over in terms of the permitting and all the processes they have to do to start work on that plant. But there's no question that the Chinese-U.S. stuff looms over that. And depending on how those negotiations go, we could be looking at a different situation down there.
Yeah. And Steve, for a governor and for a congressional delegation that likes to talk economic development, and who doesn't, it's a politically difficult situation. They have a president of their party who keeps toughening his rhetoric and imposing tariffs that could already has directly impact our state.
And who enjoys broad support among the Republican primary electorate, which makes it much more challenging. You know, for a long time, Republicans had a situation whereas their elected officials didn't always agree with their base. The elected officials of Republicans, and many Democrats too, have all been free traders for a long time. Many of their voters were not always helped by free trade in some ways. Some of them lost their jobs as a result of it. There were other factors, but that was one thing. Not only that, but the governor is, the president is also a strong southern border protector, and that was something that wasn't always on the top of the radar screen for Republican elected officials. So it's an awkward situation. There's some pushback on the tariffs this time, and you saw some of the quotes from our delegation. There's some concern. At the same time, Mexico has announced that they're going to send 6,000 newly created National Guard troops. Now, they don't really exist at this point. It'll be years before they get down there. but along the southern border. So the president is playing hardball, and it ties into what he said during the campaign. So really, the congressional delegation doesn't have a whole lot of choice right now, but to at least in their rhetoric, not say too much against it, and then we'll see what happens. The Congress there's been some threats to not approve the tariffs, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and we tend to focus China, but still we've got Mexico, Canada,
right.
Our two big markets.
I was going to say, yeah, Mexico is the second largest trade partner with Arkansas, second only to Canada. That's $870 million in exported goods that go from Arkansas to Mexico. All that could be up in the air. All that could be put at risk in these tariff negotiations. Randy Veach of the Arkansas Farm Bureau says we cannot afford to lose those markets. And Arkansas farmers have already been kind of under the gun this year anyway with China already, but also the weather. The weather's been terrible for Arkansas farmers. So it just sort of piles on one thing after another for Arkansas farmers as these negotiations wear on. But Mexico is a dimension that I don't think that they probably expected to happen this year.
Yeah, we'll take just a moment and talk about the weather, because it is still almost impossible to assess the damage that's been done. We do know on the ag sector anyway that farm fields, you can't plant a flooded farm field, although I'm told there's a practice years ago that was called mudding cotton. We're concerned about corn and soybeans too. Mm-hmm. And the infrastructure damage, the last indications that I had anyway, guys, from the Department of Transportation is that we can't even begin to assess how much damage we'll have to deal with until the water simply goes down.
Mm-hmm. Not only that, but there's going to have to be repairs to the levees, which were somewhat in disrepair beforehand.
Yeah.
Most of the levees in Arkansas were built by the Corps of Engineers many, many decades ago, and then turned over to local boards that have died off in some cases. In many cases.
Districts, yeah.
In fact, in a lot of these levees, no one was in charge, and there has been deterioration. Now, they've actually done pretty well considering the onslaught that we've had, but there are still ongoing issues with this. The failure of the state to maybe keep these up as well as they could have been. This is a 500-year flood. That doesn't mean that this flood will not occur in 499 years. What a 500-year flood means is that every year there is a 0.2% chance that this can happen. That's a kind of a misnomer, but that means that this could happen again next year. There's a 0.2% chance that this would happen again next year, and if it did, the state's levees would be greatly deteriorated from where they are this year. So that's going to have to be a major issue moving forward, is making sure that we think about what we need to do to prevent this from happening again.
Back to the economy directly, dollars and cents, the world's largest corporation up in Bentonville, obviously a trade and tariff story.
That's right. Yeah, Walmart has, of course, been, I think their CFO has been on the phone with the Treasury Secretary of the United States, making clear sort of what the impact would be if tariffs are imposed or increase on China. Now they've got Mexico to worry about. These companies are going to have to eventually, in some form or fashion, pass along these costs on to the American consumer.
And that's really where we're getting at, isn't it? It's just the consumer.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, those are the folks who are going to pay for it. People at the grocery store, people at your big box discount stores are going to have to foot the bill for all of this at the end of the day. And speaking of the big box stores, Walmart having its annual shareholders meeting in Northwest Arkansas, that ended today. A week of events, and probably the highlight of the event, for business reporters anyway, and political people, was the Wednesday business meeting. The business meeting that's supposed to be the event that really doesn't get the attention, but it did because Bernie Sanders attended the business meeting and presented a shareholder proposal that would allow representation on the corporate board of hourly employees. And of course it was defeated, and everyone knew it would be. But you had the image there of Bernie Sanders, a critic of Walmart and its labor practices, accusing Walmart to the face of the executives of paying starvation wages. And so that was an interesting moment, and Walmart has answers to that. Doug McMillon, in sort of a pre-buttal address, talked about that it was time for the federal government, for Congress, to look at raising the federal minimum wage from $7.25 up to something else.
Is this the heresy, it seems, for a CEO?
I don't think so. I mean, a lot of companies are raising their minimum wage, and Walmart indeed has raised theirs as well. They will talk about the investments they have made in their employers, and they've got a vested interest in doing that. They're in a very competitive environment right now, and everything they can do to make their experiences better for customers will help the bottom line, and that includes improving the in-store experience. And so they view that investing in their workers will improve that experience as well. But they've also got to compete for workers, and we've got a near full employment level across the country, and so whatever they can do to keep and retain workers, attract and retain workers, would be worth it to them too.
Yeah, so we continue to look at workforce training.
Yeah, and,
and try to bring that along.
That'll be up to the state will do its part, and the companies do their part. Walmart's it has raised its base pay to $11 an hour, and so it would make sense that the CEO would be calling for a higher federal minimum wage, because he is competing for workers in this environment with some companies that aren't doing that. He can't do it, he has to compete with Target for their type of employees, but then he also has to compete with others who are paying less. So companies do these things, they know what they need to do in order to be competitive, and when you have the might of Walmart, you would be encouraging policymakers to increase the federal wage to where you're paying.
Yeah, got into there, guys, because we're simply out of time. Thank you for yours. We'll see you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.